They rejected her for her pale skin and called her a curse. But one stormy night, when a wounded man knocked on her door, she didn't know he was the enemy king, nor that healing him would spark a love powerful enough to start a war. Welcome to Kingdom's Secrets. Tell me, where are you watching from? The wind howled across the northern woods, sweeping through the branches like a whisper of judgment. Every gust carried with it a memory of a kingdom that had cast out its own child. Ilara had not seen another soul in years. She lived where no messenger rode and no banner flew, in a small wooden cabin built by the only man who had ever pitied her. He was gone now, long buried beneath the frost, and the silence that remained had become her only companion. She rose before dawn each morning, gathering snow in a clay bowl to melt for water. Her hair, long silver and pale as moonlight, fell across her shoulders like a veil she never chose. She had once tried to dye it, to hide what she was, but the pigment always vanished, as if the forest itself refused to let her lie. They called her the Cursed One, the Child of Winter, a daughter born with skin whiter than snow, a mark the priests had called the Wrath of the Heavens. Her mother had pleaded for mercy. Her father, the king, had ordered the guards to take the infant far away. "She will bring ruin to the realm," he had said, not looking once at the cradle. Years later, the words still haunted her like a wound that never healed. Yet the forest had not been cruel. The pines sheltered her. The foxes came close without fear. Sometimes at dusk, when the light turned silver and the snow shimmered like glass, she would imagine the trees whispering her name. Not in hatred, but in recognition. Still, loneliness was a slow poison. She had forgotten the sound of laughter, the taste of bread made by another's hands. Even her own reflection in the frozen pond had become a stranger. That morning, the silence felt different, heavier, tense, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The birds had gone quiet. The air smelled faintly of iron. She stepped outside, pulling her cloak tight against the cold. The horizon stretched endless and white. The trees etched black against the snow. Nothing moved until she saw it, a trail, faint, broken, and of blood on the snow. Her heart stilled. The prints were human, half erased by the wind, leading toward her cabin. She followed them with trembling steps, her breath fogging in the icy air. The track stopped near her door. Her pulse quickened, then came the sound. 3 heavy knocks, slow, deliberate, echoing through the wood. Someone was outside, someone who shouldn't have survived this far north. Ilara froze where she stood. And as the last echo faded into the forest, she realized that whatever waited on the other side of that door would change her fate forever. The knocks echoed again. 3 dull thuds that seemed to shake the silence itself. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. She stood frozen, her hand hovering just above the latch. No one ever came this far. No one could. The nearest village was 3 days away, through forests that even hunters feared. For a moment, she wondered if the sound had come from her mind, some cruel trick of solitude. But then came a voice, weak and low, muffled by the door. "Please." Just one word, faint, trembling, human. Her heart twisted. Against every instinct that told her to run, she unlatched the door. The wooden beam groaned as it opened, releasing a gust of cold air that stung her cheeks. What she saw made her stumble back a step. A man knelt in the snow before her cabin. His cloak was heavy with frost, torn at the shoulder, its edges darkened with blood. His hands, gloveless and raw, pressed weakly into the ground as if to keep himself upright. Snowflakes clung to his hair, dark, almost black, and his breath came out in shuddering clouds. A silver circlet, barely visible beneath the snow and dirt, glinted faintly against his temple. "Please, help me," he whispered again, lifting his head. Their eyes met. Ilara's chest tightened. His face was pale, drawn, yet proud, the kind of strength that even pain couldn't erase. But his lips trembled, and she could see the exhaustion in his eyes. Without thinking, she rushed forward, catching his arm as he swayed. His body was heavy, the weight of someone who had been running, fighting far too long. "You're hurt," she said, her voice shaking. He gave a faint, bitter smile. "I've been worse." Ilara looked around, her breath quick and shallow. The snow around them was stained red. Whatever had happened, it had not been far. "Can you walk?" she asked. He didn't answer. His eyes began to roll back, his strength fading. "Wait." She tightened her grip, half dragging, half guiding him toward the door. "You can't stay out here." "You'll die." The man didn't resist. His head fell forward against her shoulder, heavy and burning with fever. Inside the cabin, the warmth hit them like a wave. The fire still glowed faintly, and the smell of pine smoke filled the small space. She closed the door with her foot, locking out the wind. She laid him down on the rug near the hearth. Steam rose from his cloak as the heat touched it. When she pulled it open, she gasped, not at the wound, but at what hung beneath his clothes, a chain of fine silver bearing the crest of a crowned falcon, a royal emblem. Her pulse quickened. Whoever he was no common soldier. She took a step back, staring at him as if seeing a ghost. The man stirred, his eyes half opening. "Don't be afraid," he murmured. "I mean you no harm." Ilara didn't move. Outside, the wind screamed against the walls. Inside, time seemed to stop. She didn't yet know his name. But before dawn, the secret he carried would threaten both their worlds. For a long while, there was only the sound of fire crackling and the soft hiss of melting snow. Ilara knelt beside the man, her hands trembling as she reached for the knife at her belt, not to harm, but to cut through the thick frozen fabric that clung to his shoulder. His breath came ragged, shallow, every exhale misting in the cold air. She peeled back the torn cloak, revealing the wound beneath, deep, ugly, but clean enough to be mended. Someone had struck him with purpose. A blade meant to kill had only missed its mark by chance. "You're lucky," she whispered, though she knew he could not hear her. "Or cursed. I'm not sure which." She fetched a basin of warm water from the hearth and began to wash away the blood. The scent of iron filled the cabin, sharp against the wood smoke. Her fingers hesitated each time they brushed against his skin. His body bore other scars, not fresh but old, marks of battles long past. Whoever he was, he had lived a life of war. The silver circlet glimmered faintly in the firelight. She tried to ignore it, tried not to see what it meant. A royal emblem. A falcon crowned, the symbol of Arvenhold. The enemy kingdom, her father's enemies. She clenched her jaw and focused on her work. The war between Arvenhold and her homeland had burned for years before her exile. Men like him had ridden through villages, burning crops, taking lives. And yet here he lay, unarmed, helpless, his life resting in her cursed hands. As she cleaned the wound, he stirred. His hand shot up, instinctively catching her wrist. His grip was weak, but his reflexes were sharp, the reflexes of someone who had lived too long on the edge of death. Their eyes met again. "Don't," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "If you mean to finish me, do it quickly." She froze. "Finish you?" "I saw your hair," he said faintly. "The snow-born witch of the woods. The stories said you were real." Her pulse throbbed in her throat. "If I were the witch they say I am," she whispered, "you'd already be dead." Something flickered behind his eyes, not fear this time, but shame. He released her wrist and sank back against the rug. "You're right," he breathed. "Then I owe you more than I can repay." Silence followed. Only the fire moved, painting golden light across his face. Handsome, yes, but hollowed by fatigue and loss. The kind of face that had seen too many winters, too many deaths. Ilara bandaged his wound in silence, wrapping clean cloth around his shoulder, then fetched a small cup of tea made from willow bark and herbs. She held it near his lips. "Drink this. It will dull the pain." He obeyed, his hand brushing hers for a brief second. His skin was hot from fever. When he finished, he let out a long breath, his shoulders relaxing as if the world itself had loosened its grip on him. "What's your name?" she asked softly. He hesitated. "Cale!" She could tell it wasn't his true name, the way his eyes shifted slightly, the way his voice caught. But she let it pass. "Rest, Cale. You're safe here." He looked at her, studying her face, as though trying to read the truth in her words. "Why would you help me?" Ilara's gaze fell to the floor. "Because once someone helped me when I didn't deserve it." He closed his eyes, and for the first time sleep seemed to claim him. When she rose, the light outside had faded into the pale grey of dusk. Snow fell in slow, silent flakes. She stood by the small window, watching it coat the trees. The forest had protected her for years. It had kept her hidden from the cruelty of men. And now, within the same walls that had sheltered her, she had brought in one of those very men, the enemy himself. She should have been afraid. But as she turned to look at him lying near the fire, his breath steady at last, she felt something else, something dangerous, curiosity. There was nobility in his features, even beneath the weariness. A quiet strength in the way his hand rested near the sword he could no longer lift. She wondered what kind of king or knight would find himself alone and hunted, wounded in the snow. That night, sleep refused to come. The storm outside grew stronger, the wind howling through the pines like a warning. She sat by the fire, knees drawn to her chest, watching the stranger's face illuminated by the shifting light. At one point, his lips moved in restless dreams. A single word escaped, soft and heavy with longing. Leora. Ilara's chest tightened. A name. She didn't know who Leora was, but the way he whispered it told her everything. Someone loved. Someone lost. When dawn broke, she rose and stepped outside. The forest was silent again, the snow glistening under the new sun. Smoke rose gently from the chimney, proof that, for the first time in years, she was not alone. She looked toward the horizon, where the mountains marked the edge of Arvenhold. If the man inside truly came from there, then trouble would follow, because the kings of men never bled alone. The man slept through most of the morning, though sleep was too peaceful a word for what he endured. He moved in restless waves, his body tense, whispering fragments of commands and names that made no sense to her. Ilara tended the fire, each flicker of flame throwing warmth and light across his face, and with every glance, her unease grew. She had hidden him, fed him, treated his wound. Yet she could not silence the thought that echoed in her mind. He is one of them, one of the men who had marched under banners soaked in the blood of her people. Still, something inside her resisted the thought, something quiet and stubborn. When he finally stirred, it was past noon. A shaft of sunlight cut through the window, resting on his face. His eyelids fluttered, his hand shifted weakly against the rug, and then he groaned. The sound low and human enough to make her heart twist. "You shouldn't move," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You tore your stitches twice in your sleep." He blinked slowly, turning his head toward her. For a moment, confusion clouded his gaze. Then recognition. "You—" He frowned slightly. "You saved me," Ilara nodded. "I did." He struggled to sit, wincing as the pain shot through his shoulder. "Why?" The question caught her off guard. "Because you would have died otherwise," she said simply. He studied her face, his eyes sharp despite the fatigue. "You knew what I was when you found me." "I knew you were human," she replied. That was enough. Something in his gaze softened, almost imperceptibly. "Most would have left me in the snow. Most would have killed me on sight," she countered. "So I suppose we're both fools." A faint smile ghosted his lips. "Then I'll gladly be a fool in your debt." Silence followed, thick, heavy, filled with the things neither dared to say. She busied herself with the kettle, pouring hot water into a small wooden cup. When she turned back, he was watching her, not with suspicion now, but with curiosity. "Your hair," he said after a moment. "It's silver." Ilara stiffened. "It's a curse." He shook his head slowly. "No, I've seen curses. This isn't one." Her eyes met his. "You don't know what it cost me." He didn't argue. He only held her gaze a second longer before lowering his head. "Then we both carry marks that cost more than they should." His tone was quiet, stripped of the arrogance she had expected from a man wearing a crown. "Drink this," she said, handing him the cup. "It will steady your strength." Their fingers brushed again, a brief electric contact that neither acknowledged. As he drank, she noticed the crest around his neck gleam faintly in the light. Her stomach knotted. She knew that symbol. Everyone did. "You're not just a soldier," she said finally, voice tight. He looked up from the cup, his expression unreadable. No, I'm not. Her pulse quickened. Then what are you? He hesitated. For a moment she thought he might lie again, but something in her steadiness seemed to disarm him. I am Kael Arvin, he said softly. King of the realm you call your enemy. The words seemed to suck the air from the cabin. Elara didn't move, didn't breathe. Her hand went slack, the cup slipping from her grasp and shattering against the floorboards. He didn't flinch. I won't beg for mercy, he said. But if you intend to turn me over to your people, at least allow me to face them as a man, not a coward hiding behind a peasant's mercy. Her mind raced. Images of fire and war, of her father's soldiers falling to Arvin blades, filled her thoughts. And yet the man before her wasn't the monster she'd imagined. He was flesh, blood, and exhaustion. A man who bled as they bled. Why are you here? She demanded, stepping closer. Why were you alone in my woods? His jaw tightened. Because my people betrayed me. Because the crown that should have protected me wanted me dead. Her anger faltered, replaced by confusion. Your own men? Yes, he said, voice low. And if they discover I'm alive, your exile will end with your death as well. The words hung between them, heavy and real. Outside, the wind began to rise again, scattering snow across the clearing. Inside, the fire burned low, its glow catching in his eyes that for the first time held no command, only honesty. I didn't come here to bring war to your door, Kyle said quietly. But fate seems to have other plans. Elara looked at him, at the man she had saved. The king she should have hated, and felt the ground shift beneath her certainty. In that small cabin, far from any throne or banner, two enemies stared at each other and saw something neither had known they'd been searching for, a reflection of their own loneliness. And somewhere deep within the silence of the forest, destiny took its first breath. The fire had burned low when Kael finally managed to stand. He leaned against the wall, his breath shallow, his hand pressed to the wound she had dressed. The morning light poured through the small window, dusting the cabin in gold. You shouldn't move, Elara said, crossing the room with quiet steps. Her voice was softer than before. Not trusting, not yet, but no longer cold. I've lain still long enough, he murmured. If my enemies are close, rest will kill me faster than steel. She stopped a few paces from him. Your enemies? He met her eyes. The ones who swore loyalty to me yesterday. There was no pride in his tone, only exhaustion, the weight of betrayal heavy in each word. Elara turned toward the window. The forest stretched endless beyond it, but she could feel the tension in the air, the stillness that came before a storm. She had lived alone too long not to recognize the scent of danger. What happens if they find you? She asked. He paused. Then you will die for saving me. The words were simple, unflinching. They fell between them like stones dropped into deep water. She folded her arms, more to hide the shiver that ran through her than from the cold. You think I'm afraid of dying? Kyle studied her for a long moment. No, he said quietly. I think you're afraid of living again. The truth of it struck harder than any threat could have. For years she had existed, not lived. And now this man, this king, had dragged the world back to her doorstep. She looked away first. You need food and rest. The rest of your wisdom can wait until you've stopped bleeding on my floor. A faint, almost invisible smile tugged at his lips. Yes, my lady exile, Elara glared. But the corner of her mouth betrayed a twitch of amusement. She busied herself with the fire, adding more wood, boiling herbs, doing anything to ignore the strange warmth that his presence had brought into her frozen solitude. By afternoon, the sound of distant voices shattered the fragile calm. Both of them froze. It was faint, no more than echoes carried by the wind, but unmistakable, men shouting, boots crunching over ice, dogs barking. Kael's hand went to his sword out of instinct. His face hardened, all trace of weariness replaced by the sharp alertness of command. How far? He asked. Too close, she said, already moving to the window. Through the trees she saw flickers of movement, dark shapes gliding through the white. How many? 5, maybe 6, her voice lowered. They're tracking blood, Kyle cursed under his breath. My trail. I was careless. He reached for his cloak, but she caught his arm. You can't fight. You'll die before you draw the blade. He met her gaze, steady and calm. Better that than endanger you, endanger me, she snapped. I was exiled to die alone in this forest. If danger finally found me, it was bound to happen. Something flickered in his eyes. Admiration, perhaps, or regret. Then I'd rather it find me first. Before she could argue, he staggered toward the door. The effort nearly sent him to his knees. She rushed forward, pressing her palm against his chest. The warmth beneath her hand startled her. His heartbeat was strong, stubbornly alive. You're not going out there, she said firmly. Not like this. He stared down at her hand, then back at her eyes. You'd shelter a wounded king from his own army? I'd shelter a man who bled on my doorstep, she whispered. For a heartbeat, neither moved. The world outside grew louder, closer. The barking of dogs now cut through the wind. Then we must make them believe no one lives here, he said. Ilara nodded, and together they moved. Fast, silent, efficient. She smothered the fire, scattered ashes to hide footprints, closed the shutters tight. He dragged his cloak across the floor to erase traces of blood. Within minutes, the cabin looked lifeless, abandoned, the kind of place where no warmth had lingered for years. They crouched behind the door as the first shadow passed the window. Men's voices, the glint of armor, the bark of hounds. One of them stopped inches from the door. Ilara's breath caught. Kyle's hand went to the hilt of his sword, but she pressed her palm to his wrist, a silent plea. The soldier lingered, listening. Then after a moment he turned away. The footsteps receded. The sound faded back into the forest. Only when silence returned did they breathe again. Ilara leaned her forehead against the door, her pulse racing. They'll be back, she said. Yes, Kyle replied. And next time they'll burn everything. She turned to face him, her silver hair falling loose over her shoulders. Then we have until dawn. He looked at her, truly looked, as if seeing her for the first time not as an outcast, not as a witch, but as a woman standing between him and death. You could leave, he said quietly. Run south. You owe me nothing. Ilara's gaze hardened. Maybe not. But I owe the forest that kept me alive. And if your men burn it to reach you, I'll have nothing left to lose. For the first time since entering her cabin, Kyle bowed his head, not in command, but in respect. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and soundless. Inside, their fates had already begun to intertwine, one step at a time, like footprints vanishing into the endless white. The forest did not sleep that night. The wind moaned through the trees like a chorus of ghosts, and the snow fell harder, thick enough to swallow every sound. Ilara had not closed her eyes once. Each time the fire dimmed, her thoughts grew darker, of soldiers, of betrayal, of what waited when dawn came. Kyle sat across from her, wrapped in a torn cloak. He watched her quietly, his face pale but his eyes alert. There was strength in him still, hidden beneath the exhaustion, the kind of strength that made others follow without question. When the first light touched the horizon, he spoke. They'll return. And they won't search quietly next time. She nodded, her hands tightening around the edge of her cloak. Then we leave before they do. He hesitated. You would leave your home for me. She looked around the small cabin, the wooden walls that had kept her warm, the fire that had been her only companion for years. Home, she said softly. This was a prison with windows. Kyle lowered his gaze, as if the words cut deeper than intended. I never asked you to risk this, and I never asked you to bleed on my doorstep, she said, rising to her feet. Yet here we are. He tried to stand, wincing as pain shot through his side. She reached him before he fell, her hand firm on his arm. You'll slow us down, she said, not unkindly. But if we move now, the snow will cover our tracks. He gave a faint smile. You speak like a soldier. I learned from the forest, she replied. It hides what it wants to keep. They left just as the light broke through the pines. The air bit at their faces, sharp and metallic. Every step crunched softly beneath their boots. Behind them, the cabin faded into a blur of white and smoke, a life erased. Ilara led the way, her movements sure, precise. She knew every tree, every hidden trail. The forest had raised her. It would not betray her now. Cale followed, his breath uneven but determined. The cold gnawed at his wound, but pride kept him upright. Each time he stumbled, she steadied him without a word. By midday, they reached the frozen stream that cut through the valley. The water beneath the ice glowed faintly blue, alive and ancient. Ilara crouched to scoop snow into her hands, pressing it against his shoulder to numb the pain. He flinched, but didn't pull away. "You should have been born in Arvenhold," he said quietly. "Our healers could learn from you." She shook her head. "I was born in a palace that wished I hadn't existed. I doubt another would do better." Kyle studied her in silence. The wind lifted strands of her silver hair, catching the light like threads of moon. There was something in her, defiance, grace, and a kind of sorrow that humbled even a king. "You were cast out for the color of your skin?" he asked at last. She nodded. "They said I carried an omen. My father, your enemy, had believed it." Kyle's jaw tightened. "Then your father was a fool." Ilara's lips parted slightly, but no sound came. No one had ever said those words aloud. The forest had whispered comfort, yes, but never vindication. "Do you know what it means?" Kyle continued, his breath misting in the cold. "To be blamed for something you never chose." She looked at him then, really looked. Every day, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy with understanding, with all the pain neither had dared to share before. When the wind shifted, they both turned sharply. Hoofbeats, faint but approaching. "They've split their ranks," Cale said. "2 riders, maybe 3. Ilara's eyes darted to the ridge ahead. "There's an old watchtower near the cliffs. It's half buried but safe enough for tonight," he nodded. "Lead the way." They ran then, as much as Cale's strength allowed, slipping between trees and frozen roots. The forest blurred into streaks of white and black, the rhythm of their breath matching the pounding of distant hooves. At last they reached the tower, nothing more than a ruin swallowed by ice and time. Inside, the air was still and cold. She helped him sit, his breath trembling as he leaned back against the stone. "You're shaking," she said. "So are you," he replied, almost smiling. For the first time she laughed, a quiet, uncertain sound that broke through the weight of fear like sunlight through fog. When she turned to tend the small flame she'd built from broken timbers, Kyle spoke again. "Ilara," he said softly. She looked at him, surprised. "You remember my name?" "I forget everything else," he admitted, "but not that." Something in her chest shifted, an ache she hadn't felt in years. Outside, the wind screamed against the old stones. Inside, 2 fugitives, once enemies, shared the warmth of a dying fire. Bound by the one truth neither could escape. In the heart of winter, they had become each other's only reason to keep moving. They had barely slept. The tower moaned with the wind, the old stones sighing beneath the weight of snow. Ilara woke before dawn, her fingers stiff from the cold. Cale lay nearby, his cloak pulled over his shoulders, his face pale but peaceful, for the first time since she'd found him. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to look at him without fear, not as a king, not as an enemy, but as a man who had somehow crossed the same invisible border that had once caged her. Outside, the forest was ghostly quiet, the kind of quiet that didn't belong to peace, but to the breath before a storm. She stepped toward the entrance, brushing frost from the old archway. The snow stretched unbroken across the clearing below. But then she saw them. Dark figures moving between the trees, horses, armor glinting faintly in the early light. Her breath caught. "Kyle," she whispered, turning back. He stirred, still half asleep. "What is it?" "They found us." In an instant the calm shattered. Kyle pushed himself upright, ignoring the pain in his shoulder. He moved to the window slit and cursed softly under his breath. 4 riders, and more behind them. Ilara's heartbeat thundered in her ears. "How did they track us?" He gave a hollow laugh. "You can cover footprints, but not fate. Fate won't save you," she said sharply. "We have to move." He turned toward her, his expression hardening. "No. If they catch you helping me, they'll kill you first. I'm already dead to them, she replied, their eyes locked, his full of stubborn pride, hers blazing with defiance. Then, almost in the same breath, both turned toward the door as a distant horn cut through the air. They had been seen. Kyle reached for his sword, but Ilara stopped him. "You can barely stand. Then help me stand," he said, his tone quiet, commanding. The voice of a king who had forgotten how to yield. She hesitated only a second before slipping beneath his arm, bearing his weight. Together they descended the old stone steps, snow crunching beneath their boots. Outside, the cold was blinding. The riders emerged from the trees like shadows given shape, cloaked men with blades drawn, their faces hard with purpose. "Stay behind me," Kyle said. "You can't fight them," she whispered. "Then I'll die trying." Before she could answer, the leader rode forward, raising his hand. "By order of the new regent of Arvenhold," he called, "the traitor king is to be taken, dead or alive." The words struck Kyle like a blow. "Regent?" he spat. "My brother," the rider smirked. "He wears your crown now, Majesty." Ilara felt him stiffen beside her. His grip on his sword tightened until his knuckles turned white. "This ends here," Kyle muttered, but she stepped in front of him. "No," she said. "Not like this." Her voice carried across the clearing, clear and strong despite the wind. "He's wounded. You'll have to kill me first." The soldiers hesitated, uncertain. The sight of her was strange even to them. A pale woman standing against the snow, silver hair shining in the light, eyes fierce as steel. Kyle's voice broke the silence. "Go back," he said to the men. "Tell my brother the crown he stole won't keep him warm when winter reaches his door." The soldiers shifted, uneasy. But one, the youngest, urged his horse forward, blade raised. Ilara didn't think. She moved. She grabbed Kyle's dagger and swung it with both hands, striking the horse's reins. The animal reared, the rider fell, a chaos erupted. "Run!" Kyle shouted. They turned, stumbling through the snow as the air filled with the clash of steel and shouting. Arrows hissed past, thudding into trees. The cold bit her face, each breath a knife in her chest. Kyle's steps grew slower. The wound had reopened. Blood stained the snow behind him. "Keep going," he gasped. "Not without you." She half pulled, half dragged him toward the river's edge, where the ice was thick and dark. Behind them, voices closed in, closer, louder. "There!" Someone yelled. Ilara spun. No time to think. She plunged her hand into the snow, grabbing a fallen torch from the chaos. The flame sputtered weakly, but it was enough. With a cry, she hurled it into the trees. The dry branches caught fire instantly, light flaring across the forest. Smoke roared upward, blinding their pursuers. Kale looked at her, astonished. "You set the forest. A live forest can regrow," she said. "Dead kings cannot." He stared at her, and for the first time truly smiled. "You're mad." Maybe. They ran until their lungs burned, until the world behind them was only smoke and silence. When they finally collapsed on the frozen riverbank, the first snowflakes of evening began to fall. Kyle lay back, gasping, the crown still clinging stubbornly to his dark hair. "If we survive this," he said between breaths, "remind me never to argue with you again." Ilara laughed, tired, breathless, beautiful in the fading light. "I'll hold you to that, Your Majesty." And for the first time since exile, she smiled without sorrow. The cave was narrow and hidden beneath an overhang of ice, invisible unless one knew exactly where to look. Ilara had found it years ago while fleeing a storm. Now, as snow swept the forest clean of tracks, it became their only refuge. Kyle leaned heavily against the stone wall, his breath ragged, his skin pale as frost. The blood on his tunic had darkened to a dull rust color, and the faint tremor in his hands betrayed the pain he refused to admit. Ilara knelt before him, lighting a small fire from the bundle of dry twigs she carried in her pack. The flame caught slowly, painting gold and amber over their faces, banishing the blue shadows that had followed them through the woods. "You've lost too much blood," she said softly. He smiled faintly. "You've said that before, and you didn't listen before." His gaze found hers in the flickering light. "I'm listening now." For a moment neither spoke. The storm outside raged like a wounded beast, but inside The world had narrowed to the circle of fire between them, a fragile warmth against the cold. Ilara dipped a cloth into melted snow and began cleaning the wound again. Her touch was gentle, almost reverent. Kyle winced once, then forced himself still. "You've done this before," he murmured. "I've stitched more torn flesh than I care to remember," she replied. "Wolves, hunters, sometimes my own hands." He studied her face as she worked, the steady calm in her movements, the way her silver hair shimmered in the firelight. "And no one ever came for you?" "No one," she said simply. "Then they're fools," he whispered. Her hands hesitated. She looked up, and their eyes met, truly met, for the first time. The distance between them seemed to disappear, filled with everything neither had dared to speak. "You shouldn't say things like that," she said quietly. "Why not?" "Because I might start believing them." Kyle's lips curved into a faint, pained smile. "Then let me be the first man whose words you should believe." She turned away, trying to hide the sudden heat in her cheeks. "Rest, we move at dawn," but he didn't close his eyes. "Ilara," he said, his voice lower now, softer. "When I was a boy, I thought the worst thing that could happen to a king was betrayal. I was wrong," she frowned, glancing back. "Then what is?" "Loneliness," he said. "Ruling a land full of people who bow to your crown, but never to your heart." The words struck something deep within her, a wound older than memory. She sat back slowly, the firelight trembling between them. "I thought I'd forgotten how to feel that," she whispered. "Loneliness. It's been my shadow for so long I stopped calling it by its name." He reached out, his fingers brushing hers, tentative, asking permission. She didn't pull away. For the first time in years, she let another's touch reach her without flinching. "I don't know what will happen when morning comes," Kyle said, his voice rough, tired, honest. "But if fate dragged me through snow and blood just to find you, then I won't curse it." Ilara swallowed hard, her throat tight. She should have said something, anything to break the spell, but words refused to come. The fire crackled softly, throwing shadows over the walls. Outside, the wind began to calm, as though the world itself was pausing to listen. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I should hate you. You're the reason my people lost everything." "I know," he said. "And yet here I am, owing you my life." Her eyes shimmered in the dim light, not with tears, but with something more dangerous, forgiveness. Kyle leaned closer, his breath mingling with hers, warm despite the cold. "Tell me to stop," he murmured. She didn't. Their lips met, not with the fire of passion, but with the fragile honesty of two souls that had forgotten what warmth felt like. The kiss was slow, hesitant, and full of everything they could not say. When it broke, she rested her forehead against his chest, listening to the unsteady rhythm of his heart for the first time in her life. Ilara realized that the world outside could burn. The snow could fall forever, and still there would be this fragile, impossible thing between them. Kyle's voice came like a promise. "Whatever happens when dawn comes, I will not let them take you." And for the first time she believed him. Dawn came quietly, too quietly. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world of white silence. Every branch glistened with ice, and the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Ilara stirred beside the dying fire, her cloak drawn close around her shoulders. Kyle was already awake, standing near the cave's entrance, one hand pressed to the wall for balance. "You shouldn't be up," she murmured. He didn't turn. "They're close." The edge in his voice made her chest tighten. She rose and crossed to him. From where they stood, she could see faint plumes of smoke curling above the trees. Movement, horses, the metallic gleam of armor catching the first light. "They never stopped searching," Kyle said softly. "They'll burn the forest until they find me." Ilara's pulse quickened. "Then we go deeper," he shook his head. "There's no deeper left, only snow and stone." She stared at him, realizing what he meant. "You're going to face them." Kyle turned at last, and in that moment the man before her was no longer the wounded stranger she had nursed by the fire. He was every inch a king, proud, fierce, unyielding, the kind of man who had carried an entire realm on his shoulders. "If I keep running," he said, They'll burn everything between here and the sea. This ends today, her throat tightened. You'll die, he smiled, not in arrogance, but in quiet resignation. Then let it be for something worth dying for. She stepped closer, anger and fear colliding inside her. You can't win, Kel! Not like this, not wounded. He reached out, brushing his thumb along her cheek. You gave me my life once. Let me decide what I do with it. The words cut deeper than any blade. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, without warning, she turned and began gathering her things, cloak, dagger, flint. Ilara, I'm not letting you go alone, she said sharply. If this ends today, it ends for both of us. He wanted to protest, but the look in her eyes silenced him. She was not the fragile outcast he'd met in the snow. She was something stronger, a woman reborn from exile and flame. They moved through the forest, side by side, their breaths visible in the cold air. The sound of hooves grew louder, closer. When they reached the clearing at the base of the ridge, Kyle stopped. This is where they'll find us, he said. Ilara glanced at him. Then this is where they'll remember us. The first riders appeared moments later, dark silhouettes breaking through the pale light. Steel gleamed. Voices barked orders. Kale drew his sword. The motion was slow, deliberate. The wound at his shoulder opened anew, staining the snow red. He didn't flinch. King Kale of Arvenhold, one of the soldiers shouted. By command of the regent, you are under arrest for treason. Kale's answer was a single word. No, the charge came fast. Ilara barely had time to duck as steel clashed against steel. Kale moved like a storm, wounded but unstoppable, every strike carrying the fury of betrayal. He parried one blow, drove his elbow into another man's jaw, then spun, his sword singing through the cold air. A blade slipped past his guard, cutting across his side. He grunted, staggered, and then the soldier fell, Kale's sword buried deep in his chest. Ilara, run! He shouted. She didn't. She had found a fallen bow, and her hands, though trembling, were sure. The first arrow flew, grazing a rider's arm. The second found its mark, straight through the leg of another's horse. The beast reared, throwing its rider. Chaos erupted. Kyle turned in time to see her standing tall among the snowdrifts, silver hair catching the light like fire. Ilara, don't you dare fall, she cried. Another rider charged. She swung the bow like a staff, striking the man across the face. Kyle was beside her an instant later, his blade finishing what she began. When the last man fell, silence returned. Sudden, brutal, absolute. Kyle dropped to his knees, the sword slipping from his grasp. Blood darkened the snow beneath him. Ilara rushed forward, catching him before he fell completely. Kale, he smiled weakly, his breath fogging against her hair. Remind me again why you didn't run. Because I finally found something worth staying for. He laughed, softly, painfully, and pressed his forehead against hers. You're the bravest soul I've ever met. And you, she whispered, are the most stubborn king who ever lived. She tore a strip from her cloak, pressing it against his wound. We have to move, he nodded faintly. There's a valley north of here, a place my brother's men won't cross. If we reach it, we will, she said firmly. Outside the clearing, the forest began to whisper again. The faint sound of wind through pines. The hush of snow falling like ash. They rose together, leaning on each other for balance. Behind them, the bodies lay still. Ahead, a single path wound into the white horizon, and though neither knew if they would see another dawn, they walked, two souls bound by choice, not fate. For the first time, the forest did not feel like exile. It felt like home. They walked until the forest thinned, and the trees gave way to light. The snow still clung to the world, but here it glittered softer, touched by the rising sun. The air smelled of pine and ash and something almost forgotten. Peace. Kale leaned heavily on Ilara's shoulder. His steps were slow, his strength nearly gone, but the fire in his eyes refused to fade. Each breath was a promise, one more step, one more heartbeat. At last, the valley opened before them. It was wide and silent, surrounded by mountains so high they seemed to hold the sky itself. In its center ran a river, half frozen, half alive, glimmering like silver beneath the morning light. Elara stopped, her breath catching. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Kale smiled faintly. "It's more than that. This is the border between my realm and yours." She turned to him. "Then we can't stay," he shook his head. "No one rules here. Not Arvenhold, not your father's crown. It's a land forgotten by both, a place neither war nor exile remembers." She looked at the valley again, the endless white stretching into calm. For years she had lived as a ghost, a secret carved into silence. Now, for the first time, she felt the weight of her exile lift, not because she had been forgiven, but because she no longer needed to be. Kyle sank to one knee beside the river, his reflection rippling faintly in the water. The crown on his head caught the light like a dying flame. He reached for it slowly, then, with a quiet breath, placed it on the snow between them. "I can't return to my throne," he said. "Not as the man I was." Elara knelt beside him, her cloak brushing against his. "Then who will you be?" He looked at her, the woman who had saved him, defied him, changed him. A man who would rather build peace than inherit war. She reached out, her fingers brushing his. "And if peace costs a kingdom, then I'll trade it," he said simply, "for one moment of truth." They stayed there for a long time, two figures against the white world, a fallen crown between them, and the silence of centuries slowly melting into something new. When Kale finally spoke again, his voice was softer. "Do you think your people will ever forgive me?" Elara smiled faintly. "Perhaps not, but they might forgive what we create." He frowned slightly. "And what is that?" She looked at him, her silver hair shimmering in the sun. "A beginning." A breeze stirred then, gentle, almost warm, carrying away the smoke of battle and the scent of blood. It moved through the trees, down into the valley, scattering snowflakes like tiny stars. Gagil reached for her hand, and she didn't hesitate this time. Her fingers found his, rough, calloused, human, and held them tightly. "When they write the songs," he said quietly, "they'll curse my name for losing the throne." "Then let them curse," she replied, "while we live free." The mountains echoed faintly, as if the world itself agreed. Elara leaned her head against his shoulder, and for the first time, the silence of the forest no longer felt empty. It felt alive, breathing, waiting in that forgotten valley, where the kingdoms of men could not reach. The girl of the winter silence and the exiled king built a new name for peace, and though history would try to erase them, the snow never would. When spring came, the forest bloomed again, and the whispers that once called her cursed now spoke her name with reverence. Elara, the woman who ended the war not with a sword, but with compassion. The child of winter had finally melted the ice in the heart of a king, and with her, the world learned to thaw. If this story reached your heart, don't let it fade into the snow. Subscribe, stay close to the fire, and tell us, where in the world are you listening from?